You're listening to the top cheating audio stories. Enjoy your listening experience. I didn't expect to be telling this story, much less sharing it on the internet. But sometimes life throws you so far off course that the only way to process the chaos is to get it all out, piece by piece. So here I am, at 2:43 a.m., hands trembling over the keyboard, still reeling from what just happened. It started like any other late evening for me. I was in my home office, a cramped little room cluttered with paperwork, contracts, and the remains of a takeout dinner I didn't finish. A cup of coffee, now cold, sat next to my laptop. My assistant, Matthew, had left hours ago, but I was still buried in work. That's what I do these days, work. I'm a corporate consultant now, which feels like a joke given where I came from, once a promising government investigator, now grinding away for businesses that cared more about their bottom line than integrity. The divorce wrecked me. I'm not ashamed to admit it. When Rebecca left, everything fell apart. My job, my reputation, my confidence. But I'd managed to carve out a life again, piece by broken piece, and I thought I'd moved on. At least, that's what I told myself. David, Matthew's voice came through the intercom, breaking my train of thought. He wasn't supposed to be here at this hour. My heart skipped a beat. Matthew never stayed late unless something was urgent. There's a young woman here to see you. A woman? I glanced at my watch. It was nearly 10 p.m. Who the hell shows up at this hour? She says it's important. She wouldn't give her name, but she insisted she won't leave until she talks to you. Tell her to come back tomorrow. Matthew hesitated. She gave me this, he said, and I heard a rustling sound over the intercom. An old photo of you and Rebecca. I froze. My hand hovered above the keyboard, unable to move. What? I croaked, my voice betraying me. It's a wedding photo, David. Yours. From almost 20 years ago. The memory of that day hit me like a freight train. The white dress, Rebecca's smile, my naive belief that we'd spend forever together. I hadn't seen that photo in years, hadn't even thought about it. Why now? Let her in, I said, trying to steady myself. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Moments later, the door to my office creaked open, and a young woman walked in. She couldn't have been more than 18, but there was something about her, something unsettlingly familiar. Her eyes. They were Rebecca's eyes, the same piercing green, but more intense, as if they carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. She stood in the doorway, clutching a small purse, her face serious but unsure. I cleared my throat, forcing myself to regain composure. I assume you have something to say? I asked, harsher than I intended. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. My name is Hannah, she said softly, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. You don't know me, but I'm your daughter. My head snapped up, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. What did you just say? You heard me. Her gaze didn't waver. Rebecca Carter is my mother. I have a twin brother, Jacob, and I think you're our father. For a few seconds, I couldn't form words. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what she was saying. This couldn't be happening. Rebecca had never told me she was pregnant when we divorced. How could I not know about this? You're lying, I muttered, more to myself than to her. This is impossible. I'm not lying, Hannah shot back, her voice sharper now. Mom never told you about us. She didn't want you to know, but I found out. And I'm telling you now because Jacob, he's dying. Dying? My voice cracked. What are you talking about? He needs a liver transplant, she continued, her tone unflinching. Greg, our stepfather, was tested, but he's not a match. I'm not a match either. You're our only hope. I was still in shock, barely processing her words. And you just show up out of the blue, expecting me to believe all this? Hannah reached in her purse and pulled out a small stack of papers. She dropped them on my desk. I found our birth certificates, the divorce records. Everything. My brother's running out of time. And if there's even a chance you're our father, we need your help. I stared at the documents, my brain refusing to process the information. My hands were shaking as I picked up the papers. Birth certificates for Hannah and Jacob, dated 18 years ago, a few months after Rebecca and I had divorced. My name wasn't on them, but there were too many coincidences. The dates, the places. It all pointed back to me. I don't understand, I mumbled, flipping through the papers. Rebecca never said anything about being pregnant. She didn't want you in our lives, Hannah said bluntly. She married Greg soon after you two split, and we were raised thinking he was our real father. I didn't find out the truth until a few months ago. I confronted her, and she finally admitted it. And Greg? I asked. What does he know about all this? Hannah's jaw tightened. He knows everything. He's been raising us as his own, but when Jacob got sick, I started questioning things. It didn't add up. Greg's not our biological father, and he knows it. But we've run out of options, David. You're all we've got. I leaned back in my chair, trying to wrap my head around it. The room felt like it was spinning. My ex-wife had hidden 2 children from me for 18 years. 2 children I never knew existed. And now one of them might die unless I could help. This is insane, I muttered. Why didn't Rebecca tell me? Hannah crossed her arms, her expression dark. Because she didn't want you in our lives. She and Greg had a plan, and you didn't fit into it. But now we don't have a choice. Before I could respond, the door opened again, and Matthew stepped inside, holding his phone. David, I've been looking into Rebecca's remarriage after your divorce, he said, his voice uneasy. It was quicker than I thought. She married Greg just 3 months after your split. My stomach dropped. 3 months? That meant the affair had started long before I'd known. Rebecca had been with Greg while she was still with me. I felt a wave of anger rising in my chest. Jesus Christ, I breathed. All this time. Hannah stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. I don't care what happened between you and my mother, she said. Right now, the only thing that matters is Jacob. If there's even a chance you're our father, we need to know. Will you help us or not? I didn't answer right away. My mind was swimming with too many questions, too much betrayal. But underneath all that, one thing was clear. If there was a chance Jacob was my son, I couldn't walk away. Not from this. Not again. I'll get tested, I said finally, my voice barely audible. But this doesn't mean anything until we know for sure. Hannah's shoulders relaxed, just a little. Thank you, she whispered, the tension still thick in the air. That's all I'm asking. I watched as she turned and walked out of my office, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The door clicked shut behind her, and I sank back into my chair, staring at the photo she had left behind. My mind replayed the last 20 minutes over and over, and with each passing second, the reality of what had just been revealed became clearer. My world had been shattered once before, but this felt different, like I was being dragged into something much bigger than I could understand. And for the first time in years, I wasn't sure if I was ready to face the truth. But I didn't have a choice. It started with Hannah's visit. After she left my office, I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the old wedding photo she'd handed me. My mind kept drifting back to everything she said, the way she laid it all out. Matter of fact, no emotion, like she'd rehearsed it 100 times before. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Instead, I spent the next few hours replaying everything Rebecca and I had been through, all the moments leading up to our divorce. I kept trying to pinpoint when things had gone wrong, but the truth was, it didn't matter anymore. What mattered now was that she had kept 2 children from me, and one of them, Jacob, was on the brink of death. By the time the sun came up, I knew what I had to do. I needed to confront her. No more waiting. No more dancing around the truth. I needed answers, and I needed them now. Rebecca still lived in the same upscale neighborhood we'd moved into just before our marriage fell apart. An estate tucked away in a gated community outside Cleveland, where money did the talking and neighbors kept their noses out of each other's business. As I pulled up the long, winding driveway, I could feel my pulse quickening. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I knew it wasn't going to be a calm conversation. I pounded on the door harder than I intended. My hand was shaking, not from nerves, but from sheer anger. I hadn't felt this kind of fury in years. When Rebecca finally opened the door, she looked the same, too much the same. Her hair was still perfectly styled, not a strand out of place. Her makeup subtle but sharp, the way she always presented herself, like everything was in control. She froze when she saw me, her hand tightening on the doorknob. "David," she said slowly, like she was trying to gauge how much I knew. What are you doing here? I didn't waste any time. I want the truth, Rebecca. About the twins. About why you kept them from me all these years. Her eyes darted away for just a second. A flash of hesitation. But she quickly recovered, her face hardening into that familiar mask of composure. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. Don't play games with me. I snapped, stepping forward into the foyer, my voice rising. Hannah came to see me last night. She told me everything. Rebecca's eyes widened, but she still didn't step back. Hannah had no right to. She had every right. I interrupted, cutting her off. Because you've been lying for 18 years. You kept me in the dark, made me believe that I was just a footnote in your life. And all the while, you were hiding 2 children, my children. Her jaw clenched. They're my children, David. Mine and Greg's. Greg isn't their father. I shot back, my voice trembling with anger. He's not Jacob's father, and he sure as hell isn't Hannah's. Rebecca finally broke, her composure cracking. Greg has been a better father to them than you ever could have been. She spat, venom lacing her words. You were never part of the plan, David. I did what I had to do to protect them. Protect them? I laughed bitterly. From what? Me? I'm their father. You kept me away for no reason other than your selfishness. You didn't want me in their lives because it didn't fit into your perfect little world with Greg. She didn't respond, but her face said it all. She had no defense, nothing she could say that would make this right. Jacob is dying, I said, my voice lowering as the weight of those words settled over both of us. Did you think you could hide that from me too? Did you think I wouldn't find out that he needs a liver transplant and none of you are a match? Her face paled. She hadn't expected me to bring that up so soon. I was going to tell you. No, you weren't, I snapped. You were going to let him die before you ever admitted that I might be his only chance. You've lied about everything, but you can't lie about this. For the first time, Rebecca looked genuinely shaken. She ran a hand through her hair, her mask slipping. You don't understand, she said quietly. There's more to this than you think. Then explain it to me, I demanded. Because from where I'm standing, you've done nothing but lie and manipulate me. Rebecca let out a long breath, avoiding my gaze. It wasn't just me, she said, her voice trembling slightly. It was my father. He made sure you wouldn't come looking for them. I frowned, the pieces not quite fitting together. What the hell are you talking about? Rebecca finally met my eyes, and for the first time in years, I saw real fear there. My father. Judge Lawson. He used his connections to make sure you were out of the picture, David. He didn't think you were good enough for me, so he pulled strings. He fabricated evidence that got you fired from your job. My blood ran cold. What? He ruined your career, she continued, her words tumbling out now, as if once she started, she couldn't stop. He wanted you gone, and he made sure of it. That's why you lost your position with the government. It wasn't because of anything you did. It was him. I couldn't breathe. The room felt like it was spinning. All these years, I'd believed that I was responsible for my own downfall, that I hadn't been good enough, hadn't been sharp enough. And now, to find out that Rebecca's father had been behind it all, that my entire life had been derailed because of some twisted vendetta? You're lying, I whispered, but I didn't even believe myself. I wish I was, she said, her voice shaking now. But it's the truth. My father never wanted you in my life. And when I found out I was pregnant, I didn't know what to do. He told me he would take care of it, that Greg would be a better father for the twins. I didn't have a choice. Didn't have a choice? I echoed, rage boiling up inside me. You always had a choice, Rebecca. You could have told me the truth. You could have fought for us. For me, for them. But instead, you let him ruin my life. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I had no sympathy left for her. I thought it was for the best, she whispered. I let out a harsh laugh. The best? For who? For you? For your father? Because it sure as hell wasn't for me. There was a long, heavy silence between us. I could feel the weight of everything crushing down on me, the lies, the manipulation, the betrayal. And then something clicked. This was never about me, was it? I said slowly. It was always about control. Your father didn't want me out of your life. He wanted you under his thumb. This was about power. Rebecca didn't answer, but the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. "Does Greg know?" I asked, my voice low. She shook her head, her lips trembling. "No, he has no idea about any of this." I took a step back, running a hand through my hair. "You've destroyed everything," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "And now Jacob might die because of it." She didn't say anything, just stood there, tears streaming down her face. But it wasn't enough. Nothing could fix what she'd done. I turned and headed for the door, my mind already racing with the next steps. I wasn't going to let her lies destroy any more lives. I would get tested. I would save Jacob if I could. But after that, Rebecca was going to pay for what she'd done, for all the years she'd stolen from me. As I reached the door, I paused, my hand on the knob. "Tell your father," I said, not turning around. "I'm coming for him." And with that, I left. But as I walked out into the cool morning air, I knew this was just the beginning. What Rebecca had told me wasn't the whole truth. There was more, much more, that hadn't yet come to light. And I was going to uncover it, no matter what it took. After my confrontation with Rebecca, I got tested. I didn't want to believe any of it, but I had to face the possibility that Hannah and Jacob could be my children. The hospital was cold, sterile, the kind of place I'd avoided for years. The nurse drew my blood in a matter of minutes, the silence in the room heavy, but the weight of what I was doing didn't hit me until later, when I found myself alone again, waiting for the results. Matthew had been digging deeper. I asked him to go back through anything he could find related to my divorce from Rebecca. Old documents, legal records, anything that might shed light on the mess I was walking into. I knew Judge Lawson had manipulated the system to keep me away from the twins, but I needed more than Rebecca's word. I needed proof. A few days later, Matthew came into my office, looking like he hadn't slept. He dropped a manila folder on my desk, thick with papers that smelled faintly of mildew. "You're going to want to sit down for this," he said, his voice low. I flipped open the folder, the first page catching my eye immediately. A document from my old attorney's office. One I hadn't seen before. "What is this?" "Proof," Matthew said, pacing across the room. "I found it buried in an old case file. Your divorce was manipulated from the start. Rebecca's father used his influence to make sure you never found out she was pregnant." I scanned the document, my pulse quickening with each line. There were notes, handwritten ones, from Judge Lawson's private correspondence with several high-ranking officials. They mentioned falsifying documents, changing court schedules, manipulating evidence. All of it designed to ensure I didn't get custody, or worse, that I never even knew about my children. They covered everything up. I muttered, more to myself than to Matthew. This was never just about the affair. "No," Matthew said, stopping in front of the window, his back to me. "It wasn't. Judge Lawson didn't want you in their lives from the start. He orchestrated the whole thing." It felt like a punch to the gut. I thought Rebecca's betrayal had been the end of it. But this was something far more sinister. "What else did you find?" Matthew hesitated. "There's more. About Jacob." I looked up. "What do you mean?" "Rebecca's medical records. The timing doesn't match," he said, turning to face me. "If she was pregnant with Jacob and Hannah during your marriage, it doesn't make sense." I frowned, trying to piece it together. "What are you saying?" "I don't think Jacob is your biological son," Matthew said carefully. "And I don't think he's Rebecca's either." That sentence hit me like a brick. I must have looked like an idiot, staring at Matthew as if I hadn't understood the words that just came out of his mouth. But once they sank in, I felt my world tilt again. If Jacob wasn't my son, or Rebecca's, then what the hell had happened? "I don't have definitive proof yet," Matthew said, his voice steady. "But the medical records, there are gaps. Times when Rebecca would have been under observation, ultrasounds that don't match the twins' birth dates. I think there's something more going on with Jacob." My mind was racing. "But Hannah? She could still be yours," Matthew nodded. "But Jacob's case doesn't add up. I think we need to dig deeper. If Rebecca didn't carry him, then who did?" A chill crawled up my spine. "You're saying Jacob was adopted? Illegally? I don't know yet, but I'd bet my job on it." I felt my stomach churn. The pieces weren't just falling into place. They were collapsing in on themselves. I had to confront Rebecca again, but this time I couldn't walk in half-blind. "Keep digging," I said to Matthew, my voice raw. "I need to go see Jacob." I wasn't prepared for what I saw when I stepped into that hospital room. Jacob was pale, almost skeletal, his eyes sunken in with dark circles beneath them. He was hooked up to all sorts of machines, IVs running through both arms, and the steady beep of the heart monitor filled the silence. He looked up at me as I entered, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Hey," he croaked, his voice weak. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to smile. "Hey, Jacob." Hannah was sitting next to him, her hand gripping his tightly. She glanced up at me, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. I nodded at her, and she gave me a small, grateful smile. "I didn't think you'd come," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here now," I replied, pulling up a chair next to his bed. He looked so much like Rebecca in that moment, it hurt. But there was something off, something I couldn't quite place. I wanted to tell him everything about the lies, the secrets, but how could I? He was too fragile, too sick. "You feeling okay?" I asked, knowing the answer, but needing to fill the silence. He shrugged weakly. "I've been better. The doctors keep poking at me, running tests. I'm tired." Hannah squeezed his hand. "You're strong, Jacob. You'll get through this." Jacob looked at her with a sad smile. "I hope so." I felt a lump form in my throat. How could I tell this kid, lying here on the edge of death, that the only life he'd known was built on lies? That the man he thought was his father wasn't, and that his real parents might not even be who he believed? Just then, the door opened, and Dr. Karen Pierce stepped in, holding a clipboard. She was tall, with short brown hair and a no-nonsense expression. She nodded at me, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Mr. Carter," she said, stepping toward the bed. "I didn't expect to see you here today." I stood up, extending my hand. I needed to see him. She nodded, glancing at Jacob, then back at me. "I was just going over Jacob's latest test results. He's stable for now, but time is running out. We need to find a match for his liver transplant as soon as possible." I swallowed hard. "I've already been tested. When will we know the results?" "Soon," she said, her expression unreadable. But then she lowered her voice, leaning in closer. "I need to talk to you privately, Mr. Carter. It's about Jacob." My heart skipped a beat. I followed her out of the room, leaving Hannah and Jacob behind. Dr. Pierce led me down the hall to a small consultation room and closed the door behind us. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice tense. Dr. Pierce hesitated, flipping through her notes. "There's something I need to discuss with you. Something I haven't mentioned to the family yet." I felt a knot form in my stomach. "What is it?" She sighed, setting the clipboard down. "Jacob's medical history. There are some discrepancies. His blood type doesn't match either Rebecca's or Greg's. In fact, it doesn't even match Hannah's." I frowned, confusion swirling in my mind. "What are you saying?" Dr. Pierce looked me dead in the eyes. "I'm saying there's a possibility that Jacob isn't related to either of them. He may have been adopted." The room went silent. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. I stared at her, trying to process what she was telling me. "Adopted?" I whispered. But Rebecca never said anything. "I know," Dr. Pierce said softly. "But based on what I've seen in his records, there's a strong possibility that Jacob was part of an illegal adoption. And if that's the case, we need to find out who his real parents are." I felt like the floor was collapsing beneath me. This wasn't just about a liver transplant anymore. This was about a boy whose entire identity might be a lie. And now it was up to me to figure out the truth. "Do you have any leads?" I asked, my voice shaking. Dr. Pierce shook her head. "Not yet, but I'll keep looking. We need to get to the bottom of this before it's too late." I nodded, my mind racing. If Jacob wasn't Rebecca's son, then who was he? And how had he ended up in this family? There were too many questions and not enough answers. I stood up, my hands trembling. "Thank you, Dr. Pierce. Keep me updated." She nodded, watching me as I left the room. As I walked back down the hall, my heart pounding in my chest, I knew one thing for sure. This was far from over. When I got back to Jacob's room, Hannah looked up at me, her eyes filled with worry. "Is everything okay?" I forced a smile, trying to hide the storm raging inside me. "Yeah," I said softly. "Everything's fine." But it wasn't. Not even close. Because now, I wasn't just questioning whether I was Jacob's father. I was questioning everything. After leaving the hospital that night, my mind was in overdrive. Jacob's weak, pale face was seared into my thoughts. The kid was fading, and yet the biggest revelation wasn't just his illness. It was that Jacob might not even be Rebecca's son. I couldn't shake Dr. Pierce's words. His blood type doesn't match either Rebecca's or Greg's. That was the last thing I needed to hear. But I wasn't going to wait around while Rebecca continued to hide the truth. No more lies. No more avoidance. I needed answers, and I was prepared to tear down whatever wall of deception she'd built around this family to get them. I made one decision that night. I was going to hire a private investigator, not some second-rate sleuth. No, I needed the best. I knew a guy, James Rourke, who I'd crossed paths with back when I was still working as an investigator. He was relentless, methodical, and had a knack for digging up the filth people went out of their way to bury. I called Rourke the next morning. "David, it's been a while," Rourke said, his voice gruff but friendly. I could hear the faint hum of city traffic in the background. He was always working, always moving. "Too long, Rourke," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need your help. It's personal." He paused. Rourke never wasted time. "Go on." "I think my ex-wife adopted a child illegally. Maybe both children. There's something off about one of them. Jacob, my supposed son. I need to know who he really is, where he came from, and what Rebecca's been hiding. And there's more. Her father, Judge Lawson, was involved in destroying my life years ago. Now I think he's connected to something much worse. I need the truth, Rourke, whatever it takes." "Illegal adoption, powerful judge, family secrets," Rourke grunted. "Sounds like the kind of mess I live for. Can you handle it?" "I'm on it," he replied without hesitation. "I'll start digging. If there's something out there, I'll find it." The days following Rourke's call were a blur. I couldn't sit still. Hannah had been staying with Jacob at the hospital, not knowing the bombshell about to hit her. The DNA test results were still pending, but every passing hour made the tension build. The phone call finally came while I was in my office, staring at my laptop, rereading the same email over and over, trying to make sense of what my life had turned into. "David Carter?" It was Dr. Pierce's voice. "Yes, that's me," I answered, already dreading what was coming next. "We have the results of the DNA tests," she said, her tone neutral. "Hannah is your biological daughter." I exhaled, a small wave of relief washing over me. At least that part of the mess was true. "But Jacob," she paused. "Jacob is not biologically related to you. Or Rebecca." My heart dropped. I knew this was coming, but hearing it confirmed was like having the ground ripped from under me. "So it's true," I whispered. "He's adopted." "Yes," she said softly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter." I thanked her and hung up. For a long moment, I just stared at the phone in my hand, the weight of everything crushing me. Jacob, lying in that hospital bed, didn't know his entire life was a lie. He didn't know the people he trusted most had kept the truth from him, and now his life hung by a thread. I had to confront Rebecca again. This time, she wasn't getting out of it. No half-truths. No more running. When I showed up at Rebecca's house, the tension was so thick I could barely breathe. I banged on the door, not caring about politeness. This wasn't a polite conversation. She opened the door, her face already hardened like she knew this was coming. "We need to talk," I said, pushing past her into the house. She followed me into the living room, arms crossed, her mouth set in a thin line. "I don't have anything else to say to you, David." "You do," I shot back. "Because the DNA results just came in." Her face paled slightly, but she held her ground. "And Hannah is my daughter." I watched her eyes flicker, as if she expected that. "But Jacob isn't. He's not yours either, Rebecca. So why don't you start explaining?" Her composure cracked then. She turned away, running a hand through her hair. "I can't do this right now." "Yes, you can," I demanded, stepping closer. "You've lied to me for 18 years, and now the truth is coming out. Tell me what's going on. Tell me who Jacob really is." Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time since all this started, she looked genuinely defeated. Jacob was adopted, she admitted, her voice shaking. But I didn't want it this way. Who is he? I pressed. She shook her head. I can't tell you. I'm protecting someone. Who? I demanded. Your father? Judge Lawson. At the mention of her father, she froze. And that was when I knew. It was him. He was behind it all. Rebecca, what did your father do? I asked, my voice low and cold. Tears welled up in her eyes. David, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But I can't. Stop, I snapped. You can't what? You can't tell me the truth? You've been lying for nearly 2 decades. I deserve to know. She sat down on the couch, burying her face in her hands. My father made a deal, she whispered, barely audible. Jacob was part of it. A deal. I felt a chill run down my spine. What kind of deal? Her voice was hollow when she answered. My father helped arrange Jacob's adoption. It wasn't legal. He had connections. There were people involved, dangerous people. He told me it was better this way, that no one would ever know. My blood turned cold. Illegal adoption? Who are these people? Rebecca looked up at me, her eyes full of fear. It's not just adoption. It's bigger than that. It's human trafficking, David. My father, he's involved with a network. I staggered backward, feeling the weight of her words slam into me. Human trafficking? This was far worse than I had imagined. And you've known this all along? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head, her tears streaming freely now. I didn't know. Not at first. But over the years, I started to piece it together. My father's been protecting them, covering it up. And Jacob was just one of many. I stood there, numb, as the reality of the situation settled over me. This wasn't just about a broken marriage or a hidden child. This was about corruption, crime, and lives that had been bought and sold in the shadows. I'm going to bring him down, I said, my voice firm. Your father, his entire network. This ends now. Rebecca looked at me, panic flashing in her eyes. You don't understand. These people, they won't stop. They'll come after you, after me, after the kids. They'll kill anyone who threatens them. I wasn't fazed. I've been destroyed before. But this time, I'm fighting back. Without another word, I turned and left the house. The door slammed shut behind me, but the sound was drowned out by the pounding of my own heart. I pulled out my phone and dialed Rourke. David, he answered immediately. I've been digging, and you're not going to believe what I've found. Try me, I said, my voice hard as steel. I've uncovered records of black market adoptions, all tied to the same network Judge Lawson's connected to, Rourke said. Jacob's adoption wasn't just a one-off. There are dozens of kids, all placed with wealthy families under the radar. And your ex-father-in-law? He's been covering for them for years. Everything inside me was boiling. I clenched my fist, the anger burning so hot I thought I might explode. What do we do next? I'll keep digging, but you need to be careful, Rourke warned. These people don't play around. If they find out we're on to them, they won't hesitate to take action. I'm ready, I said, my mind already racing with plans. I'm bringing them down. All of them. Then let's do it, Rourke said, his voice steady. But watch your back. You've just walked into something bigger than either of us expected. I hung up, my mind spinning. Jacob wasn't just an adopted child. He was part of something far more sinister. A criminal network that had been operating in the shadows, protected by one of the most powerful men in the state. And now I was going to destroy them. It started with a phone call from Rourke. I was sitting in my office, papers scattered everywhere, my mind already tangled in knots. After my confrontation with Rebecca, I knew the conspiracy was deeper than I'd thought. But when Rourke's voice crackled through the phone, it was clear things were about to get worse. David, you're not going to believe this, he said, his tone sharper than usual. I leaned forward in my chair, gripping the armrests. What is it? I've found more. A lot more. This isn't just about Jacob's adoption. It's much bigger than that. I've got documents, emails, wire transfers, connections to international human trafficking rings. Your ex-father-in-law is right in the middle of it, and he's not alone. My heart pounded in my chest. I felt like the ground beneath me was shifting again, and I was struggling to keep my balance. Who else is involved? High-level officials, business tycoons, even law enforcement. Judge Lawson has been covering for some very dangerous people, and they've been using their positions to move money, children, and God knows what else across borders. It's been going on for years. The air in the room felt thick. I was suffocating in it. How solid is this evidence? Solid enough to bring them down, Rourke replied. But we need to move fast. If Lawson catches wind that we're onto him, he'll make sure everything disappears. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. We need to take this to the FBI. I've already started putting things in motion, Rourke said. I've contacted a few agents I trust, but we need you to make the official report. You're the one with the personal connection to Lawson. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Send me everything you've got. I'll make sure the FBI gets it. An hour later, I was standing in front of the Cleveland FBI office. The sun was setting behind me, casting long shadows across the street. In my hand was a thick folder filled with all of Rourke's findings. Emails, bank records, surveillance photos. Everything we had on Lawson and his network. As I walked through the glass doors, I felt a pit form in my stomach. I'd spent years in government service, working alongside law enforcement. I knew how this worked. But now I was on the other side of it, the guy bringing in evidence that could topple powerful men. And these weren't just any men. They were the kind who didn't hesitate to silence anyone who threatened them. I approached the front desk, my palms sweating. I need to speak to Agent Sarah Mason, I said, my voice a little rougher than usual. The receptionist looked me up and down, then picked up the phone. After a brief conversation, she nodded and waved me toward the elevator. Third floor. She's expecting you. When I reached Mason's office, she stood up to greet me. She was tall, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. I'd worked with agents like her before. Professional, methodical, and relentless. Mr. Carter, she said, shaking my hand firmly. I understand you have something for us. I do, I replied, handing over the folder. This is everything I've gathered on Judge Henry Lawson. It's not just about a corrupt adoption. There's a trafficking ring behind it. Lawson's been covering for them, and he's connected to some very dangerous people. Mason's face didn't change as she flipped through the documents. We've been watching Lawson for a while, she said, but we didn't have enough to bring him in. If what you have here holds up, it's going to blow this wide open. I'm not looking for revenge, I said quietly. I just want the truth to come out. Lawson's protected by powerful people, but someone has to stop him. Mason nodded, her eyes meeting mine. We'll take care of it, Mr. Carter. But you should know this won't be easy. Once we start pulling on this thread, it's going to unravel fast. You and anyone connected to you could become targets. I understand the risk, I said, my jaw clenched. But I'm not backing down. The sting operation happened quicker than I expected. The FBI didn't waste any time once they had solid evidence in hand. I was kept out of the inner workings, probably for my own protection, but I knew things were happening behind the scenes. Lawson's network was about to collapse, and I wanted to be there when it did. But before the operation could get underway, I had to confront Rebecca and Greg one last time. I needed to know just how deep Rebecca's involvement went. I wasn't sure I could trust her anymore, if I ever could, but I needed answers. I showed up at their house without warning, just like I had before. This time, Greg was home. He greeted me at the door, confusion etched on his face. David? What's going on? He asked, stepping aside to let me in. We need to talk, I said, my voice firm. All of us. Rebecca appeared from the living room, her face pale when she saw me. She knew what was coming. Greg, on the other hand, was clueless. What's this about? Greg asked, looking between the two of us. I know about Jacob, I said, cutting to the chase. I know he's not my son. He's not Rebecca's either. Greg blinked, his confusion deepening. What the hell are you talking about? Rebecca sat down on the couch, her hands trembling. It's true, she said softly. Jacob was adopted. It wasn't legal. My father, he made sure it happened. Greg's face twisted in disbelief. What? You told me Jacob was... He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening as the truth hit him. You lied to me? I had to, Rebecca whispered. I didn't have a choice. Greg stood there, stunned, his hands clenching into fists. You knew about this, and you didn't tell me? I've been raising that boy, thinking he was ours. Rebecca started to cry, but I wasn't here for her tears. I stepped closer, my voice cold. It's worse than you think, Greg. Judge Lawson isn't just involved in a shady adoption. He's part of a human trafficking ring. He's been selling children to wealthy families under the table, and Jacob was one of them. Greg staggered back, his face pale. Jesus Christ, he muttered. Well, what have we done? I turned to Rebecca, my anger boiling over. You knew more than you let on, didn't you? You might not have known everything, but you knew enough. And you kept quiet because you were afraid of your father. Rebecca looked up at me, her eyes filled with guilt. I didn't know it was this bad, she whispered. I swear, I didn't know about the trafficking. But you knew it wasn't right, I said, my voice tight. And you did nothing. You stayed silent. I was scared, she cried. My father, he would have destroyed me if I had said anything. I shook my head. You had a choice. You could have protected Jacob. You could have told me the truth. But you didn't. She stood up, desperation in her eyes. David, please don't go to the authorities. We can work this out. I'll give you full custody of Hannah. Just don't let this ruin everything. I stared at her, disgusted. You think this is about bargaining? You think I want Hannah to be some kind of chip in your twisted game? No. This is over, Rebecca. I'm going to the FBI, and they're going to take your father down. Greg was still reeling, his hands shaking as he ran them through his hair. What happens now? I looked at him, my voice hard. You should get a lawyer. Because once this comes out, your life is going to change. And not for the better. I turned and left the house without looking back. As I stepped out into the cool evening air, I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. But for the first time in a long time, I knew I was on the right path. A few days later, the FBI sting went into full motion. I wasn't privy to all the details, but I knew enough. Agents were moving in on Lawson's associates, tapping phones, freezing accounts, setting up arrests. And I was ready. Mason kept me updated as the operation unfolded. We've got enough to bring Lawson in, she said over the phone. This is going to be big, David. The media is going to be all over it. Good, I replied. Let the world see what he's done. But I knew this wasn't the end. There were still questions about Jacob, about the other children who had been trafficked. And somewhere deep down, I had a sinking feeling that Lawson's network was bigger than anyone realized. The storm had started, but I wasn't sure I'd survive it. It didn't take long for the FBI to make their move. Rourke's intel had been solid, rock solid. Judge Henry Lawson, my former father-in-law, had been at the center of an elaborate web of corruption for decades. Human trafficking, illegal adoptions, money laundering, it was all there hidden in the folds of his judicial robes. And now it was being ripped out into the light. The news broke with a fury I hadn't seen in years. Lawson was arrested in his office, surrounded by FBI agents in front of the media's flashing cameras. The headlines were everywhere within hours. Respected judge behind trafficking ring plastered across every major news outlet. The image of him being led away in handcuffs was all over the TV, his once untouchable reputation now in tatters. I watched it happen, sitting alone in my living room, my hands still trembling from the weight of everything. But this wasn't just about Lawson. The investigation had unraveled a web of powerful figures, business tycoons, politicians, and even law enforcement officers, all connected to the trafficking ring. It was bigger than any of us had anticipated, and the fallout was just beginning. The morning after Lawson's arrest, I got a call from Agent Sarah Mason. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the urgency behind it. David, we brought Lawson in. He's not saying much, but the evidence is damning. It's only a matter of time before the rest of his network crumbles. I exhaled, relief mixing with the tension still coiled tight in my chest. Good. He deserves everything that's coming to him. There's something else, she continued. Rebecca has been brought in for questioning. She's cooperative, but I think you should know that she's going to cut a deal. A deal? I felt my blood pressure spike. What kind of deal? She's agreed to testify against Lawson in exchange for immunity, Mason said. She claims she didn't know the full extent of his involvement in the trafficking, and the evidence supports that she wasn't directly involved in the worst of it, but she knew enough to be implicated. So she walks away? I asked, my voice tight with frustration. She won't go to prison, Mason confirmed. But her life won't be the same. The media's already sniffing around. Her reputation, her career, her relationships, they're all shattered. I didn't know how to feel about that. Part of me wanted her to pay for what she'd done, for keeping Jacob's true identity from me, for letting her father's influence destroy my life. But another part of me knew that prison wouldn't fix any of that. Her real punishment would be living with what she'd done. What about Jacob? I asked quietly. Mason hesitated. We've confirmed that Greg isn't a match for the liver transplant. We're still searching for alternatives, but the situation is critical. Time's running out. A cold dread settled over me. What about me? I'm not his biological father, but could I still be a match? It's unlikely, but we could try, Mason said. It's worth testing. The hospital felt different this time. I wasn't just there as an observer, but as a potential lifeline for a boy whose entire world had been turned upside down. Jacob was still in his hospital bed, hooked up to machines, pale and weak. Hannah was sitting beside him, her hand wrapped around his, trying to be strong for both of them. But the fear in her eyes was undeniable. Hey, Dad, Hannah said softly as I walked into the room. I forced a smile. Hey, how's he doing? He's hanging in there, she said, her voice shaky. But the doctors, they don't know if he's going to make it. They need to find a match soon. I swallowed the lump in my throat. They're going to test me. I know I'm not his biological father, but there's a chance. Hannah looked up at me, hope flickering in her eyes. You do that? Even after everything? I nodded. Of course I would. He's still my son. The test results came in the next day. I was at the hospital when Dr. Karen Pierce walked into the room, her expression unreadable. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. Well, I asked, my voice barely steady. Dr. Pierce glanced at her clipboard, then looked up at me, a faint smile on her lips. You're a match. The relief that washed over me was immediate, but it was mixed with disbelief. I wasn't Jacob's biological father, yet somehow, I was his best chance for survival. It didn't make sense, but at that moment I didn't care. All I knew was that I could save him. When can we do the surgery? I asked, not wasting any time. We'll prep you immediately, Dr. Pierce said. The sooner, the better. The surgery was grueling. I'd never been through anything like it before, and waking up afterward felt like I'd been hit by a truck. But I didn't care about the pain. All I cared about was whether it had worked. When I opened my eyes, Hannah was sitting by my bed, her face lit up with the first real smile I'd seen in days. It worked, Dad. Jacob's going to be okay. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension leave my body. Thank God. The weeks that followed were a blur of recovery, for both Jacob and me. I spent most of my time at the hospital, making sure he knew that I was there for him, that I wasn't going anywhere. And slowly, piece by piece, we began to rebuild what had been broken. Jacob had been through more than any kid should have to endure. The truth about his adoption, his illness, the chaos that had erupted around him, it was more than enough to destroy someone. But he was strong, stronger than I had expected. And I knew, in my heart, that we would get through this together. Rebecca, on the other hand, was a different story. After the plea deal, she disappeared from the public eye, retreating into the shadows of her ruined life. Her relationship with both Hannah and Jacob was fractured, possibly beyond repair. They knew she had kept secrets that had nearly cost them everything. And no amount of apologies could fix that. As for Greg, he left shortly after everything came to light. He couldn't handle the weight of the truth, the lies that had built the foundation of his family. I couldn't blame him, but it left Rebecca alone, picking up the shattered pieces of her life. Months later, as I stood in my kitchen, making coffee while the morning sun filtered through the windows, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Hannah and Jacob were still asleep upstairs, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had my family back. A real family. Not the one that had been taken from me by lies and manipulation, but the one I had fought to rebuild. But just as I was starting to believe that everything was finally settling, I got a call from Agent Mason. Her voice was serious, and I could hear the weight behind her words. "David, we need to talk," she said. "What's going on?" I asked, a sinking feeling settling in my gut. It's about Dr. Karen Pierce, she said. She's gone missing. Missing? I repeated, my heart skipping a beat. What do you mean? She was part of Lawson's trafficking ring, Mason said grimly. She helped cover up the adoptions, including Jacob's. We've been investigating her, but before we could bring her in, she vanished. We think she had inside knowledge of the investigation. I stared at the phone, my mind racing. Dr. Pierce, Jacob's doctor, the woman who had overseen his care, who had been part of saving his life, was involved in the very network I had spent months trying to destroy. We'll find her, Mason said, her voice firm. But for now, you need to be careful. We don't know what she's planning. I hung up, my mind spinning. Just when I thought it was over, another shadow had emerged, another loose thread that needed to be unraveled. And I knew then, standing alone in my kitchen, that this story was far from over. Thank you for listening to this story. Subscribe to the channel, put a like under the video, and write a comment about how you like this story.